a grieving farmer, single dad, struggling to save his land and keep up for his little girl, finds a pregnant woman in distress, takes her in and helps her. Together, they heal the land and each other, building a family and living again. If these stories about kindness, hope, and second chances touch your heart, please subscribe to our channel. There are more to follow. The wind had a way of speaking across the empty fields, low and hollow, like it remembered when the soil was rich and the farmhouse windows glowed long into the night. Now, dust chased itself in small circles by the gate, and the once white fence had gone gray, splintered where time and neglect had carved their initials. It was late October, the kind of evening that turned gold into ash, and Jack Harper stood on the porch, thumbs hooked in the belt loops of his jeans, watching the horizon as if it might offer a different answer this time. The land had grown quiet since Mara died. 2 years, and still, her laughter clung to the corners of the farmhouse like cobwebs too delicate to dust away. Jack had tried to carry on, waking before the sun, checking the irrigation lines she once mapped out with colored string, fixing the tractor she'd named Clara. But the harvest had shrunk like breath on cold glass. The soil wouldn't listen to him the way it had listened to her. Behind him, through the cracked screen door, the faint sound of a child's spoon tapping against a chipped bowl drifted through the air. "Daddy, the milk's gone bad again." He turned. Lily, 10 and quiet like her mother, sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of dry cereal and 2 braids already unraveling. She didn't complain, she rarely did, but there was a crease in her brow Jack wished he could iron out with a touch. "I'll get more in town tomorrow," he said softly, stepping inside and placing a hand on her shoulder. She leaned into it without a word, and for a brief moment, he let himself believe that was enough. They finished dinner in silence, the kind of silence that lives in old houses, settled, familiar, a third presence at the table. After Lily went to bed with her threadbare bunny tucked under one arm, Jack lingered by the wood stove, holding a letter he hadn't opened. The envelope had the bank's name printed in cold ink. He already knew what it said. Final notice. Auction in 30 days. He didn't open it. Instead, he placed it beside the old recipe book Mara had written in by hand, each page a love letter to the land and the life they'd once dreamed would outlast them. Outside, night fell like a curtain of ink. The wind picked up. The barn creaked. He almost didn't hear it the first time. The soft scrape of hay, the sharp breath of someone holding still. It could have been the wind. It could have been the fox that sometimes slipped through the broken slats for warmth. But something in Jack stirred. A pull. That old gut feeling he hadn't trusted since the day he buried her. He pulled on his coat and boots, grabbed the old flashlight, and stepped into the cold. The beam flickered over familiar shapes, rusted tools, empty feed sacks, the broken-down tiller that hadn't run since last spring. Then he saw her. Nestled between 2 hay bales, half covered in a tattered wool blanket, was a woman. Young. Pregnant. Her hair clung to her cheeks with sweat, and her eyes widened as the light caught her. She didn't move. Neither did he. The barn held its breath. "Please," her voice cracked. "Just a night. I'll be gone by morning." Jack took a slow step forward. She looked ready to bolt, but her body betrayed her. Too tired. Too cold. Her fingers trembled around the edge of the blanket. One arm curved instinctively around her swollen belly. "How far along are you?" he asked quietly. She blinked, unsure if he was threatening or helping. 7 months. He nodded once, then turned the flashlight away from her face. "I've got soup on the stove," he said, voice like worn denim. "Come inside before the frost bites." She didn't move right away. Neither did he. Then, with careful slowness, she stood, wincing as she steadied herself. Jack didn't offer his arm. Something told him she wouldn't take it. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of old cedar and tired warmth. She hovered near the door while he reheated the soup and slid a clean bowl across the counter. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause. "Nora." "I'm Jack." She glanced around, photos on the wall, a girl's coat hanging by the door, the quiet hum of something lived in. "You have a daughter," she said. He nodded. "She's sleeping. And she's safe." Nora gave the smallest nod back and ate slowly, like someone unused to being given enough. Later, he set up the pull-out couch by the fire, gave her Mara's old quilt, and didn't ask why she'd ended up in his barn. She didn't offer to explain. The storm rolled in heavy that night. Rain tapped against the windows, and thunder rumbled like a memory you couldn't quite forget. In the flicker of the firelight, Jack sat alone in the kitchen with a mug of weak coffee, staring at the photo of Mara and Lily from the last good summer. He didn't know what he was doing, offering shelter to a stranger when he couldn't even save his own home. But there was something about the way Nora had looked at the barn. Not with fear, not with shame, with grief. He recognized it. Morning came slow, wrapped in mist and the soft crackle of the stove. Lily padded into the kitchen and stopped short when she saw Nora still curled beneath the quilt. Jack met her gaze and gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Nora stirred, blinking as the world returned. She looked at Lily with something close to apology. But Lily, old beyond her years, simply walked over and held out a glass of water. Nora smiled for the first time. They didn't ask where she'd come from. Not yet. Instead, Jack showed her the broken irrigation lines, the weeds choking the east field. She asked careful questions, too careful for someone just passing through. He watched her kneel in the dirt, press her fingers into the soil, close her eyes like she was listening. "You've been around farms," he said. "I used to study them," she replied, brushing dust from her hands. "Soil health, regeneration. Not that it matters anymore." Jack didn't push. He just handed her a spade and kept digging. By afternoon, Lily brought them lemonade in a mason jar, and Nora smiled again, twice in one day. Jack watched her from the shade of the old pecan tree, wondering what it would be like to let someone stay. That night, after Lily was tucked into bed with a book Mara used to read, Jack stepped out onto the porch. The moon hung low, full and wide, like a blessing. Beside him, Nora leaned against the post, arms crossed over her belly. "This place," she said, voice almost a whisper. "It doesn't give up, does it?" Jack looked out over the darkened fields, the quiet barn, the empty sky. "No," he said, "but sometimes I do." She didn't answer, just stood there beside him, both of them held in the hush between what was and what might be. And, in the silence, something small took root. The mornings had a stillness about them now, quieter than before. The sun rose slow through the mist, its light soft and distant. It spread gently over the fields like an old promise, and Jack's hands, calloused and tired, rested on the wood of the fence as he watched the barn from a distance. The world outside was vast, and yet it had never felt smaller. The house had become a place of quiet exchange, a nod in the hallway, the soft scrape of feet across the floor at night, the kind of rhythms that didn't need words. Inside, the scent of fresh bread filled the house as Nora, with her delicate hands and her quiet way of moving, shaped dough. Jack watched her sometimes from the corner of his eye as she worked beside the window. He'd catch glimpses of her face softened by the light, the faintest smile on her lips as she tended to things that had always been her own. It was the small things, the soft gestures, that seemed to build this fragile bridge between them. Nora had brought a silence to the house that wasn't like the one that had settled after Mara's passing. This silence was full of waiting, of things unsaid, things that didn't need to be said. And there was Lily. She was the quiet keeper of these small moments. Her once hesitant steps through the house had turned into a constant presence, her eyes bright and careful as she watched Nora from a kitchen table, her fingers tracing the worn edges of a book she held. Lily, who still wore her mother's old apron, had begun to slip in and out of the kitchen without Jack noticing. She'd hand him a cup of coffee in the morning, warm, just the way Mara had, and ask if he needed help with the barn. She'd look at him with those quiet eyes, waiting, expecting. And Jack couldn't bring himself to turn her down, not when she looked at him like that. One afternoon, when the sun was high and the air was thick with the scent of rain, Nora appeared at the kitchen door, her face pale but determined. "Jack," she said, voice steady, "we need to talk." Jack wiped his hands on a rag, setting the wooden spoon down. His chest tightened instinctively. He had learned to read the small movements, the way Nora pressed her lips together, the way she shifted her weight when something weighed on her heart. About what? He asked. About this land. About your farm, she said softly. You know, it's not about just keeping the soil healthy. It's about what's beneath it, the water, the nutrients. It's about a balance that's been broken. Jack's eyes met hers, guarded, but something in her voice, something in the way she was standing, made him listen. It's just soil, Nora, he muttered, trying to dismiss her. Nora moved closer, reaching for the cloth on the counter. No, Jack. It's more than that. I've studied this, remember? I can help. The weight of her words settled over him, her eyes full of something Jack hadn't seen in a long time. A quiet, unsaid understanding. Help me, he said finally, the words raw on his tongue. Help me save this place. She nodded, her hands brushing his as she turned to grab her jacket. The evening air hung heavy and thick with the scent of impending rain. They walked out together, not as strangers, but as two souls who had somehow found each other in this broken world. The next few weeks became a dance of sorts. Jack worked with the animals, Nora with the land. She would walk with him through the barn, explaining how to dig deeper into the soil to see the life beneath, how to use the old irrigation channels to carry water where it was needed. She spoke with quiet authority, a kind of serenity that pulled Jack along, piece by piece, even though he didn't yet understand fully. Sometimes she would kneel in the earth, her hands covered in dirt, and Jack would stand back, watching her with a slow sort of reverence. The way she worked, the gentleness with which she coaxed life back into the ground, felt like something sacred. In the evenings after the chores were done, she would sit by the fire and read books on plant life, on soil regeneration. Jack would settle in across the room, his hands always busy with something, mending a chair, fixing a tool, but his gaze would often drift toward her, lingering longer than he intended. One night, as the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the walls, Lily climbed onto Jack's lap, the weight of her small body a comfort he didn't realize he needed. Nora glanced over, a soft smile playing at her lips. Is she always this clingy? Nora asked quietly, not unkindly. Jack laughed, though it came out more tired than he intended. She's a lot like her mother. Lily stirred in his arms, her small fingers brushing against his chest, her eyes wide as she caught sight of Nora. I can help, Lily whispered, her voice quiet but certain. I can help you too. The words seemed too big for such a small girl, but there was something about the way she said them that made Nora pause. She looked over at Jack, who nodded slowly. And so they began. Lily spent her afternoons with Nora in the garden, handing her tools, watching as Nora carefully tended to the plants, and over time, she grew accustomed to the way the earth felt in her hands. It was in these small moments, these quiet exchanges, that something began to form between them. A bridge built on small kindnesses, a shared glance, a hand offered without words, a smile that said everything they didn't know how to say. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Jack sat at the table, his hands cradling a cup of warm tea. Nora had just finished washing the dishes, and the air in the room felt lighter than it had in weeks. Thank you, Jack said, his voice low, for staying, for helping. She stopped, turning to him. Her eyes were soft, too soft, and the corners of her mouth trembled, as if she wanted to say something more, but didn't have the words. I don't have anywhere else to go, she said simply. And in that moment, it didn't matter what her past had been. She was here, and they were together. In the quiet of the evening, the firelight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and Jack felt, for the first time in a long while, like he wasn't so alone. It was small, quiet, but in that moment it was enough. The wind had begun to shift. It came across the field, carrying with it the first true hints of autumn. Jack stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the golden light of the evening stretch long across the land. The soil beneath his boots had changed. It wasn't just a matter of the weather or the seasons. It was something more, something subtle and deep, like the roots of a tree finally finding their way back to life. Nora stood beside him, her hand brushing lightly against his. It was the quietest of touches, but it was enough to send a quiet shiver through his chest. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them had become its own kind of language, something warm and unspoken, wrapped in the shared weight of what had come before. I can feel it, Jack said, his voice low and rough. The Earth. It's different. Nora didn't answer right away. She simply nodded, her eyes on the horizon, the wind playing through her hair. There were moments now when the stillness was so complete that Jack could feel as though they were suspended in time, caught between the past and whatever fragile future lay ahead. The barn had become a place of solace. Jack had started to trust Nora in a way he hadn't thought possible again, after everything with Mara. She didn't rush. She didn't push. She simply worked, side by side with him, teaching him the small rituals of care he had forgotten. Together, they worked the land, breaking through the hardness that had come from years of neglect. It wasn't just the land that was healing, though. Jack could feel it within himself too, like the dry cracks in his heart were slowly being filled with something he hadn't expected to find, a kind of peace. It was in the small moments, like how Nora would sit across from him at the table, her hand still lingering on the rim of her cup, as if she too needed the silence to settle before the words could come. Or when Lily would run past him, her laughter echoing in the halls, reminding him that life, in its simplest form, was still here. The house had changed, too. It wasn't just walls and floors anymore. It was becoming a home, a refuge from the world outside. There was a warmth now that had been missing for so long. The fire crackled in the evenings, and the scent of Nora's cooking would fill the house, making Jack forget about the weight of the farm, if only for a few moments. One evening, as the last rays of light bled into the sky, Nora stood at the window, gazing out over the fields. Her back was to Jack, but he could see her clearly, her hands resting on the sill, her silhouette soft in the golden glow. She had started to change in ways too. There was something different in the way she moved, like the weight of the world had begun to ease from her shoulders, if only a little. He moved quietly behind her, unsure of the words he wanted to say. But when he reached her side, he didn't speak. Instead, he simply stood there, his shoulder brushing lightly against hers. For a moment, they both stood in the quiet, looking out over the land they had both come to claim as their own, as if they could feel the past and the future swirling together in the space between them. Nora sighed softly, her breath a gentle exhale that filled the silence. "I never thought it would be like this," she said quietly. "That I'd find someone who could make me feel like I had a place." Jack didn't know how to respond. He'd never been good with words, and what he felt now was too large to fit into the constraints of language. But he didn't need to say much. His hand, warm and calloused, found hers once more, and for a brief moment they stood there, just two people, holding on to something fragile, something they both knew wasn't guaranteed. "Thank you," he said after a long pause. It was simple, but it felt heavy with meaning. "For everything." Nora's smile was small but genuine, her eyes lifting to meet his. "There's no need to thank me. You've already given me more than I ever expected." The words hung in the air between them, unspoken things flowing in the space between their hearts. It was a new kind of tenderness, one built on time and small kindnesses, a softness neither of them had thought they deserved, but had found anyway. Later that night, after the kitchen had been cleared and the dishes set to dry, Nora pulled out an old notebook she had kept with her, one she had written in since she was a young woman, chronicling her work and her dreams. Jack sat beside her as she flipped through the pages, his fingers resting lightly on the edges of the paper, as though he was afraid the fragile words might fall apart in his hands. "I used to have dreams," she said softly, her voice thick with the weight of years. "Big ones. But somewhere along the way, I lost them. I thought they were just for other people who didn't have to fight so hard to keep the earth alive." Jack didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The simple act of being there, of sharing the moment with her, felt like the most important thing in the world. Nora turned the page, her fingers tracing the words. "I thought I'd always be alone, that my work would be all I had." Jack watched her closely, something stirring deep inside of him. He knew what it was like to lose everything, to feel like the world had taken away more than you could ever hope to give back. But as he looked at Nora, at the way she held herself with such quiet strength, he saw someone who had already started to rebuild. Not just the land, but herself. "Not anymore," Jack said quietly, his voice steady but full of something unspoken. Nora looked at him, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. No, not anymore. And in that moment, something changed. It wasn't dramatic or earth-shattering. It was quiet, like the soft settling of earth after a long drought. But in that silence, Jack knew they were both planting something new, something that would take root slowly but surely. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling the leaves in the trees and carrying with it the faintest scent of rain. It was the smell of renewal, the promise of growth. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth spreading through the room, and Jack could feel something stir deep within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of hope, of possibility. He reached over, taking Nora's hand once more, and the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was simply a pause, a breath before the next part of their story would begin. The sun rose over the farm, its golden light spilling slowly over the furrows of the field, casting long shadows that stretched like memories across the land. The earth had changed. It was no longer the dry, cracked surface it had been 2 years ago, when Jack had stood alone in the barn, mourning the loss of his wife. Now, there was life in the soil. There was hope. Jack stood at the edge of the field, his boots worn and scuffed from a season of hard labor, but his heart, though heavy, felt lighter than it had in years. Beside him, Nora worked with the ease of someone who had found a place to belong. Her hands, calloused from years of work, moved with confidence as she guided the plow across the earth. The rhythmic hum of the tractor was a steady, comforting sound, one that had come to symbolize something more than just the passing of time. It symbolized a future. Nora's eyes met his for a moment as she paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. She didn't speak, but there was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken bond forged in silence and small moments of shared labor. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was simply the space they needed to breathe, to grow together. It had been almost a year since she had first come to the farm, broken and pregnant, her world as uncertain as his own. Yet here they were, two people who had lost so much, but somehow, against the odds, had found each other. And in that finding, something unexpected had blossomed. A family, in its most fragile form. Jack watched her work, his thoughts drifting to the small things. The way her laughter had become a constant presence in the house. The way Lily had begun to call her mama, without even realizing the weight of the word. It wasn't just the land that had been healed. It was the people. Slowly, quietly, piece by piece, they were becoming something more than the sum of their losses. The breeze shifted, cool against the skin. It carried with it the smell of fresh earth, mingling with the faint scent of pine from the nearby trees. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to simply be in the moment. The years of struggle, the nights spent awake worrying about the farm, had all led him here, to this small, tender corner of the world. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. He felt light. Nora's voice broke through the stillness. "Jack, look at this." She stood a few paces ahead, her eyes wide with surprise. In her hands, she held a small bundle of green, something fragile, something new. It was a plant, its roots barely visible in the soil, its tender leaves reaching toward the sky. Jack moved closer, his breath catching as he looked down at the small sprout in Nora's hands. It was the first sign of life from the seeds they had planted together, and it seemed like a miracle. Something so small, so delicate, had taken root. And with it, they both knew that the farm, like them, was beginning again. Nora smiled, her face softening in the light of the morning. "It's a start." "It's more than a start," Jack said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a beginning." The words hung between them, heavier than they seemed. It was the start of something, not just for the land, but for them. They were both starting over, slowly and painfully. But with each passing day, they were finding more and more of what they had lost. And more importantly, they were finding each other. That evening, after the work had been done, after the fields had been tended to, and the evening meal was shared, Jack sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. Nora sat beside him, the steady warmth of her presence a quiet comfort as they both gazed at the night sky. There was something deeply peaceful in the way the world slowed at night. The stillness of the farm, the distant sound of crickets, and the soft rustle of the leaves in the trees. It was as though the earth itself was sighing, content in its own quiet rhythm. Nora rested her head on his shoulder, the weight of it gentle, as if it had always been meant to be there. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. In this silence, there was a deeper communication happening, a connection forged not through words, but through the shared experience of finding peace again, after so much turmoil. "You've done it," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. Jack turned his head to look at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "The farm," she said, nodding toward the fields. "You've brought it back to life." Jack shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We've brought it back to life." And it was true. The farm had been on the verge of collapse, the land dry and barren, its future uncertain. But through all of it, through the long nights, the endless days of toil, and the quiet, unspoken moments, they had found a way to revive it, to bring it back to something beautiful. Nora's hand found his in the dark, her fingers wrapping around his. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the most important thing in the world. It was the quietest of promises, the promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. Jack squeezed her hand, and in that small, tender moment, he understood something deep within him. The land might have been the place where they planted their seeds, but it was the love, the trust, the quiet kindness between them that would keep them rooted. This farm, this family, would be their legacy. It wasn't about what had been lost. It was about what was being found, one day at a time. And in the stillness of the evening, surrounded by the quiet hum of the land, Jack felt something stir within him. A hope, a certainty that the future was waiting for them, just beyond the horizon. And in that moment, he knew that the fields of tomorrow would be filled with something more than crops. They would be filled with the quiet strength of a family, slowly but surely finding its way back to life. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.